Horizontal inequalities are inequalities between groups, as opposed to vertical inequality, inequality among individuals or households. And of course, the big question is which groups? And the answer is really which groups are important, salient in societies. In some cases, it's racial groups, in some ethnicity, in some religion. So there are a variety of ways you can divide people up. And also what's very important about horizontal inequalities, it's not just about income. It's also about access to services. It's also about recognition of a group's culture, whether their language is recognized, whether their religion is recognized, and the national holidays, their concerns, or just another one group. And finally, it's about political inequalities. And the inequalities are particular groups excluded from political power, because all these things matter. I came to the issue of horizontal inequalities through work on conflict and trying to understand why civil war happened. And it was whilst I was doing that, there's a lot of evidence showing that actually vertical inequality doesn't affect wars very much. But then I came across case study after case study where inequality between groups was obviously the fundamental cause. And it was inequality in all these dimensions I was talking about. Actually, we can see it today in the Palestine-Israel conflict that's ongoing. All these inequalities are evident, and they're a sort of fundamental cause. And the cause is both for the richer group and the poorer group. The richer group wants to hang on to its privilege. The poorer group wants to get equality and fairness. And again, exactly what's happening in Israel-Palestine. Okay, so that's horizontal inequalities. And the topic of my chapter is, how is that related to democracy? And broadly, you find that there is a relationship if you look across statistics, that countries with lower horizontal inequalities have more democracy. But I think we need to look at what we mean by democracy. And of course, the whole book is about that. But there are different types of democracy. And there's some democracies which are much more likely to share power across groups than others. And in particular, what is very relevant in my chapter is the distinction between majoritarian democracy, where the winner takes all, so to speak, and democracies in which power is shared in one way or another, perhaps by proportional representation, perhaps by explicit sharing of particular roles you might have. If the president's of one group, then the vice president's of another one. So the second type of democracy, as you might expect, is much more suited to group issues, to inequalities among groups. And what we find when we look around countries which have been successful in sustaining democracies and ones that haven't, they tend to have lower horizontal inequalities, the one that have sustained democracy. That's partly because otherwise they sometimes move into conflict and therefore they don't have democracy. So that democracy breaks down if it's too exclusive. So that's one issue, one reason horizontal inequalities and democracy are related. And then of course there's the other way around, that if you have fairly shared power, then along with that comes fairly shared distribution of education, of health, regional expenditures and so on. So you tend to get more equality. And the chapter actually looks at a whole series of case studies and compares countries with different demographic composition, by which I mean there's some countries with, say, just two major groups. One may be bigger than the other. And then if one group takes all the power, that's obviously, there's going to be trouble. There are other countries which multiple groups, and there's no way in which any single group can take power. And in those countries, which aren't so many, but Tanzania is a good example, then you tend to have shared power, and even whoever gets power has to serve all the groups or most of the groups in the country. And then you tend to have more equality. And there are all sorts of intermediate possibilities. But in brief, the answer is that majoritarian democracy is not well suited to countries with horizontal inequalities, and shared power is a much more appropriate form of government.